All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're taking a look at a true behemoth of history, charting the incredible rise, peak, decline, and ultimate fall of the Ottoman Empire. We're unpacking an epic 600-year life cycle.
Think about it, 600 years. How does any state survive that long? Understanding the Ottomans really requires us to look at them almost like a living, breathing organism. We're talking about a dominant force that stretched across Europe, Asia, and Africa. How do you possibly maintain that kind of grip? And maybe even more fascinating, what eventually brings a 6th century superpower to its knees?
To figure that out, we're going to break this massive timeline down into 5 main eras: the birth of an empire, the golden age of expansion, stagnation and internal turmoil, the sick man of Europe, and finally, collapse and the modern republic.
Section 1. The birth of an empire, spanning the 1300s to the 1400s.
So out of the ashes of the crumbling Byzantine and Seljuk powers, this small Anatolian state just sparks to life. It officially kicks off around 1299 with Osman I, which, by the way, is exactly where we get the name Ottoman. They moved incredibly fast, totally capitalizing on their neighbors' missteps. By 1326, they had snatched up Bursa for their new capital, and then they pushed right into Europe with a huge win at Kosovo in 1389. But the real game changer? 1453. Mehmed II pulls off the impossible and captures Constantinople. Suddenly, the Ottomans aren't just a regional threat, they are a permanent, terrifying fixture on the world map.
And you might be wondering, how exactly did they pull off this kind of rapid conquest? Well, it essentially comes down to Europe's very first modern standing army, the Janissaries. Set up under early rulers like Orhan and Murad I, this was an incredibly elite infantry force. And here's the catch. They were actually made up of Christian kids taken from conquered lands, converted to Islam, and trained to be absolutely, unquestionably loyal to the Sultan. They couldn't even marry. They were quite literally the relentless military backbone of the early empire.
What's really fascinating here is the mindset of these early conquerors. Take Mehmed the Conqueror. We usually picture him as this totally ruthless warlord, right? But look at this quote. When he actually backed away from fighting Vlad Dracula, yes, the Vlad Dracula, he basically says he respects the guy's skills too much to just crush him. It shows a leader so confident, so acutely aware of his own empire's immense power after absorbing the Byzantines, that he could literally just shrug and walk away from a fight he didn't see the value in.
Moving into Section 2, the golden age of expansion, covering the 1500s. Now that they're firmly established, the Ottomans essentially turn into an unstoppable juggernaut. Get this, under Sultan Selim I alone, the empire's territory balloons by roughly 70%. 70%! In a shockingly short window of time, using cutting-edge muskets and cannons against lesser-equipped enemies, they just swallow up Egypt, the Levant, and the Hejaz. The whole geographic and cultural center of gravity for the empire shifts massively overnight.
Then comes his son, Suleiman the Magnificent. And again, we get this surprisingly nuanced leadership. When Suleiman defeats the Hungarian troops and finds the slain body of King Louis II, he doesn't gloat, he actually offers a surprisingly empathetic prayer for his fallen rival. It's wild, really. It completely humanizes a ruler that the West viewed almost exclusively as a terrifying conqueror, showing us a highly complex guy who genuinely respected his adversaries.
But Suleiman wasn't just out there expanding borders to places like Belgrade and Rhodes. He entirely rewired the empire from the inside out. Actually, to the Ottomans, he was known as Suleiman the Lawgiver. He completely overhauled criminal, land, and tax laws, stuff that stayed in place for centuries. He also beefed up protections and religious tolerance for Jewish and Christian populations, explicitly condemning things like blood libels. It was this exact mix of internal stability and cultural flourishing that locked this era in as a true golden age.
Which brings us to Section 3, stagnation and internal turmoil, spanning the 1600s to the 1800s.
Because, as history always shows us, golden ages never last forever. Right around the 17th century, the empire's greatest strengths mutate into the exact catalysts for its decay. The script flips from outward expansion to desperate defense. Look at this timeline. In 1622, the Janissaries literally assassinate Sultan Osman II, which was completely unprecedented. Then, externally, they hit a brick wall with a devastating defeat at the Battle of Vienna in 1683. That kicks off a brutal domino effect. By 1699, the Treaty of Karlowitz slashes their influence in the Balkans, and by 1774, they're taking absolute humiliating beatings from an expanding Russia.
And you know those Janissaries we talked about earlier? Talk about a double-edged sword. By the 18th century, that fiercely loyal, hyper-disciplined standing army had completely morphed into a corrupt, rebellious political mafia. Instead of fighting enemies, they were staging mutinies, starting riots, and literally murdering any Ottoman leader who dared mess with their power. The exact instrument that built the empire was now violently holding it hostage from within.
Things got so bad internally that the Ottomans basically became a geopolitical chessboard for foreign powers. France and Russia were aggressively playing tug-of-war with the Sultan to secure alliances. Take a look at this snippet from Napoleon Bonaparte writing to Sultan Selim III. He's buttering him up, calling him an invincible prince, but in the exact same breath, he's strong-arming him over Russian influence. The days of the Ottomans dictating terms to Europe were dead. Europe was now dictating to them.
That takes us right into Section 4, the Sick Man of Europe, covering the 1800s.
They didn't get that grim nickname for nothing. The former superpower was hemorrhaging territory, and the map was quite literally shrinking in real time. You've got Serbian and Greek independence movements totally fracturing the Balkans. They completely lose control over their Egyptian province, and they are just endlessly bleeding resources in horrific conflicts with Russia, like the Crimean War. Basically, opportunistic European powers were constantly funding these local revolts and then stepping in to force peace treaties that carved away Ottoman sovereignty piece by piece.
Now, to be fair, they didn't just throw their hands up and quit. Sultans like Mahmud II and Abdulhamid II tried furiously to stop the bleeding through radical westernization. In 1826, Mahmud finally manages to completely abolish that corrupt Janissary core. Huge step. They then kick off the Tanzimat reform era to aggressively modernize society, bringing in European-style civil codes and public schools all the way up to their first real constitution in 1876. But man, despite all that massive effort, it was just too little, way too late against the sheer crushing weight of external pressure.
Finally, Section 5, Collapse and the Modern Republic, the 1900s.
This is the absolute chaotic sprint to the finish line, the literal ashes out of which a phoenix would eventually rise. Nationalist movements are boiling over, and in 1908, the Young Turk Revolution forces the restoration of the constitution, basically gutting the Sultan's absolute power. Then, the First Balkan War hits in 1912, more devastating losses. And then comes the fatal blow, dragging the empire into World War I in 1914. But, as we'll see, from that total destruction, the modern Republic of Turkey is officially founded by 1923.
The sheer speed of this final collapse is honestly just staggering. It's a complete freefall. Libya and the Dodecanese Islands lost to Italy. Macedonia is totally chopped up by the Balkan League. Albania declares independence. And after the absolute meat grinder of World War I, they are forced to hand over all remaining rights to North Africa and Arab Asia. The once mighty apex predator of the global stage was now systematically dismantled and partitioned by the Allied powers.
The real death blow, of course, was that disastrous World War I alliance with Germany. It ended with the Armistice of Mudros, which dealt the ultimate humiliation. Allied troops literally occupying Constantinople itself. But, you know, every action has a reaction. That occupation sparked a massive, fierce nationalist pushback. Mustafa Kemal stepped up, led the incredibly bloody Turkish War of Independence, and successfully fought off the Western Allies. Because of him, the Ottoman Sultanate was permanently erased, the final sultan fled into exile in 1922, and Kemal, who we now know as Atatürk, paved the way for an entirely new, independent Turkish Republic.
When you look at this entire 600-year life cycle, it is just a stark reminder that the clock is always ticking. No matter how huge or invincible an empire seems, from a tiny Anatolian tribe to an untouchable global superpower, right down to the sick man of Europe, the bill always comes due. It kind of makes you step back, look at the superpowers running our world today, and ask yourself, who is going to be writing the next page of history? Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. I really hope this deep dive gave you a fresh perspective on the grand sweep of history.